The third year they forgot was when something inside me finally died. I sat alone at my dining room table on September 15th, staring at the birthday cake I'd bought myself from the grocery store, watching the single candle burn down to nothing. No calls, no texts, no acknowledgement that the woman who gave them life had turned 72. That's when I knew what I had to do. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Joan Roberts, and I never imagined I'd be the kind of mother who would write her own children out of her will. But after 3 consecutive years of forgotten birthdays, I realized that sometimes the people who should love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. This is the story of how I learned to value myself when my own family couldn't be bothered to remember the day I was born. I live in a quiet neighborhood in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, in the same colonial house where I raised my 3 children as a single mother after their father walked out when the youngest was only 8. For 43 years, I've called this place home. Every corner holds memories of scraped knees I bandaged, homework I helped with, birthday parties I threw when money was tight but love was abundant. I thought those memories meant something. I thought they built bonds that couldn't be broken by time or distance or the selfish pull of adult lives. I was wrong. Let me take you back to the beginning, to understand how we got here. My children are Michael, 38, Sarah, 35, and Jennifer, 32. 3 beautiful souls I poured my heart into raising after Robert decided fatherhood was too much responsibility and disappeared into his midlife crisis with a 23-year-old secretary. I worked double shifts at the textile factory, took night classes to become a bookkeeper, and somehow managed to get all 3 of them through college without taking on crushing debt. I thought I was building something lasting. I thought the sacrifice meant something. Michael lives in Chicago now, married to a woman named Brenda, who treats me like an inconvenience when they visit twice a year. He's a successful corporate lawyer, the kind who wears expensive suits and drives a BMW, and I'm proud of what he's accomplished. But somewhere along the way, he forgot that his success started in a cramped apartment where I used to iron his school clothes at midnight after working 12-hour days. Sarah moved to Denver after college and became a marketing executive. She married Craig, a nice enough man who barely speaks during family gatherings, and they have 2 children I rarely see. When I call, she always sounds rushed, always has somewhere else to be, always promises to call back later. Later never comes. Jennifer stayed closest to home, only an hour away in Philadelphia, but distance isn't measured in miles. She's an art teacher, unmarried, and the one I thought understood me best. We used to talk for hours about books and life and dreams. But even she has grown distant, caught up in her own world of gallery openings and weekend trips with friends who wouldn't know my name if their lives depended on it. The first forgotten birthday happened 3 years ago, when I turned 69. I had spent weeks looking forward to it, not because birthdays mean much at my age, but because it was the first one since my cancer scare the year before. I had beaten breast cancer, gone through the surgery and chemotherapy, and emerged on the other side grateful for every day I had left. My birthday felt like a celebration of survival, of getting to see another year. I woke up that morning with anticipation humming in my chest. I made myself a nice breakfast, put on the blue dress my mother had always said brought out my eyes, and waited for the phone to ring. I cleaned the house twice, baked cookies thinking maybe someone would stop by, and checked my phone so many times I wore down the battery. By evening, when the silence had stretched into something painful, I called Michael first. When he answered, I could hear the noise of a restaurant in the background, laughter and clinking glasses that reminded me how alone I was. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I was just wondering if you had a nice day." "Oh, hi, Mom," he said, distracted. "Yeah, we're out with clients. Can I call you back tomorrow?" I waited for him to remember, for the recognition to dawn in his voice. But it never came. "Of course," I said. "Have a good evening." The third year they forgot was when something inside me finally died. I sat alone at my dining room table on September 15th, staring at the birthday cake I'd bought myself from the grocery store, watching the single candle burn down to nothing. No calls, No texts, no acknowledgement that the woman who gave them life had turned 72. That's when I knew what I had to do. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Joan Roberts, and I never imagined I'd be the kind of mother who would write her own children out of her will. But after 3 consecutive years of forgotten birthdays, I realized that sometimes the people who should love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. This is the story of how I learned to value myself when my own family couldn't be bothered to remember the day I was born. I live in a quiet neighborhood in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, in the same colonial house where I raised my 3 children as a single mother after their father walked out when the youngest was only 8. For 43 years, I've called this place home. Every corner holds memories of scraped knees I bandaged, homework I helped with, birthday parties I threw when money was tight but love was abundant. I thought those memories meant something. I thought they built bonds that couldn't be broken by time or distance or the selfish pull of adult lives. I was wrong. Let me take you back to the beginning, to understand how we got here. My children are Michael, 38, Sarah, 35, and Jennifer, 32. 3 beautiful souls I poured my heart into raising after Robert decided fatherhood was too much responsibility and disappeared into his midlife crisis with a 23-year-old secretary. I worked double shifts at the textile factory, took night classes to become a bookkeeper, and somehow managed to get all 3 of them through college without taking on crushing debt. I thought I was building something lasting. I thought the sacrifice meant something. Michael lives in Chicago now, married to a woman named Brenda who treats me like an inconvenience when they visit twice a year. He's a successful corporate lawyer, the kind who wears expensive suits and drives a BMW, and I'm proud of what he's accomplished. But somewhere along the way, he forgot that his success started in a cramped apartment where I used to iron his school clothes at midnight after working 12-hour days. Sarah moved to Denver after college and became a marketing executive. She married Craig, a nice enough man who barely speaks during family gatherings, and they have 2 children I rarely see. When I call, she always sounds rushed, always has somewhere else to be, always promises to call back later. Later never comes. Jennifer stayed closest to home, only an hour away in Philadelphia, but distance isn't measured in miles. She's an art teacher, unmarried, and the one I thought understood me best. We used to talk for hours about books and life and dreams. But even she has grown distant, caught up in her own world of gallery openings and weekend trips with friends who wouldn't know my name if their lives depended on it. The first forgotten birthday happened 3 years ago, when I turned 69. I had spent weeks looking forward to it, not because birthdays mean much at my age, but because it was the first one since my cancer scare the year before. I had beaten breast cancer, gone through the surgery and chemotherapy, and emerged on the other side grateful for every day I had left. My birthday felt like a celebration of survival, of getting to see another year. I woke up that morning with anticipation humming in my chest. I made myself a nice breakfast, put on the blue dress my mother had always said brought out my eyes, and waited for the phone to ring. I cleaned the house twice, baked cookies thinking maybe someone would stop by, and checked my phone so many times I wore down the battery. By evening, when the silence had stretched into something painful, I called Michael first. When he answered, I could hear the noise of a restaurant in the background, laughter and clinking glasses that reminded me how alone I was. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I was just wondering if you had a nice day." "Oh, hi, Mom," he said, distracted. "Yeah, we're out with clients. Can I call you back tomorrow?" I waited for him to remember, for the recognition to dawn in his voice. But it never came. "Of course," I said. "Have a good evening."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Actual tears over the phone. "I'm the worst daughter in the world," she sobbed. "I've been so self-absorbed lately. I'm coming over right now." She did come over, with a bottle of wine and takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. We spent the evening looking through old photo albums, remembering birthdays from when they were children. I let myself believe that this conversation would stick, that next year she would remember without prompting. I should have known better. The third forgotten birthday broke something in me that I don't think can ever be repaired. September 15th of this year arrived like any other Tuesday. I woke up, made my coffee, and sat on the back porch watching the neighbor's cat hunt in my garden. I didn't expect anything. I had learned not to hope. But the absence of hope is different from the absence of hurt. When the day passed without a single acknowledgement from any of my children, I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something worse. It was indifference. That night, I sat at my dining room table with the grocery store cake and its single candle, and I made a decision. I was done being the mother who always forgave, who always understood, who always made excuses for their selfishness. I was done loving people who couldn't be bothered to love me back. I blew out the candle and went to my bedroom, where I kept important papers in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I pulled out the folder containing my will, the one I'd had updated 2 years ago when I thought we were still a family that cared about each other. Reading through those pages, seeing their names listed as equal beneficiaries of everything I'd worked for, everything I'd saved, everything I'd built, made my stomach turn. Why should they inherit the house where they couldn't be bothered to visit? Why should they split the life insurance money I'd faithfully paid for decades while working jobs that barely covered the bills? Why should they benefit from my death when they couldn't celebrate my life? I had given them everything. My youth, my dreams, my financial security, my emotional energy. I had put their needs before my own for over 40 years, and this was what I had to show for it. 3 grown children who couldn't mark a calendar or set a phone reminder, or show 1 ounce of the consideration I would give to a casual acquaintance. I closed the folder and made myself a promise. Things were going to change. I was going to change them. The next morning, I called my attorney, Harold Weinstein, who had been handling my legal affairs since before the children were born. Harold was 75, sharp as a tack, and had seen enough family drama to fill several novels. When I told him I wanted to revise my will, he didn't ask many questions over the phone. He simply scheduled an appointment for the following Friday. "Joan," he said when I arrived at his office, settling into the familiar leather chair across from his mahogany desk. "What can I do for you?" I had rehearsed this conversation, but sitting there in the afternoon, sunlight streaming through his windows, the words felt heavier than I'd expected. "I want to change my beneficiaries," I said simply. Harold raised an eyebrow but kept his expression neutral. After 4 decades of practice, he'd learned not to show surprise at family complications. "All right," he said, pulling out a yellow legal pad. "What changes are you thinking about?" I took a deep breath. "I want to remove Michael, Sarah, and Jennifer from my will entirely." Now his eyebrows went up. "Joan, that's a significant change. Are you sure you've thought this through?" "I've been thinking about it for 3 years," I said. "They've forgotten my birthday 3 years in a row. Not busy, not distracted. Forgotten. Completely. And I've realized that if they can't remember the day I was born, they don't deserve to benefit from the day I die." Harold set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. "Have you considered talking to them about how this makes you feel? Sometimes people need to be told what's important to us." I appreciated his gentle approach, but I was past the point of needing to explain myself. "Harold, I spent 43 years being their mother. I taught them right from wrong, kindness from selfishness, love from indifference. If they haven't learned by now to show basic consideration for the woman who raised them, that's not a communication problem. That's a character problem." He nodded slowly. "Where would you like your assets to go instead?" I had thought about this carefully. I want to establish a scholarship fund for single mothers trying to get their education. Women who are working multiple jobs and raising children alone, the way I did. I want my house to go to a housing nonprofit that helps families in need. And I want a portion to go to the Cancer Research Center where I was treated. Harold made notes as I spoke. "These are all worthy causes, Joan. But I have to ask again. Are you certain this is what you want? Family relationships can be complicated, but they're not always irreparable." "I'm certain," I said. "For 3 years I've given them chances to show they care. They've failed every single time. I'm not going to spend whatever years I have left waiting for them to grow a conscience." We spent the next hour going through the details, the legal language, the specifics of how my assets would be distributed. Harold was thorough and professional, but I could tell he was troubled by the finality of what I was doing. "Joan," he said as we wrapped up, "I'm going to have this drafted and ready for your signature next week. But I want you to take that time to really consider this decision. Once you sign it, once this becomes your legal will, there's no taking it back without going through this whole process again." "I understand," I said. "And I'll be here next Friday to sign it." I left his office feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time in years, I was taking control of my own story instead of waiting for other people to write it for me. The rest of that week passed quietly. I went about my normal routine: grocery shopping, tending my garden, reading the mystery novels I'd been collecting for years. But underneath the ordinary activities, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer Joan Roberts, the neglected mother. I was Joan Roberts, the woman who knew her worth. I didn't call my children that week. For the first time in memory, I didn't check in on Michael's work stress, or Sarah's busy schedule, or Jennifer's latest creative project. I didn't send encouraging text messages or forward funny articles I thought they might enjoy. I simply lived my life without making them the center of it. It was remarkable how much mental energy that freed up. On Friday, I returned to Harold's office and signed the new will without hesitation. My signature was steady, my mind clear. As I watched Harold notarize the document and file it away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. "It's done," Harold said quietly. "Are you at peace with this decision?" "More at peace than I've been in a long time," I told him honestly. That evening, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't thinking about my children's absence from my life. I was thinking about my own presence in it, about the choices I was making, about the woman I was becoming in the space between who I used to be and who I might still become. I thought about my mother, who died when I was 35, and the children were still small. She never got to see them graduate, or get married, or become the successful adults they eventually became. She never got to experience being forgotten by her grandchildren, never had to wonder if the love she gave was valued or taken for granted. Maybe that was a blessing. I thought about the single mothers who would someday benefit from the scholarship I was creating. Women who were making the same sacrifices I had made, working the same double shifts, taking the same night classes, hoping their children would remember their love when they were older. At least my pain might spare someone else the disappointment of unmet expectations. I thought about the families who would live in my house after I was gone, who would fill these rooms with laughter and arguments and all the messy beauty of people who chose to show up for each other. The house would continue to be a home, just not for the people I had originally imagined. As darkness fell and the fireflies began their ancient dance in the honeysuckle by the fence, I realized that I felt sorry for my children. Not sorry enough to change my mind, but sorry for what they were missing. They would never know the depth of satisfaction that comes from choosing love over duty, consideration over convenience, presence over productivity. They would learn eventually that love isn't guaranteed just because you share DNA. They would learn that relationships require maintenance, that people need to feel valued, that taking someone for granted is the fastest way to lose them. But they would learn those lessons without my inheritance, and that was exactly as it should be. I finished my wine and headed inside, turning off lights and checking locks the way I had every night for decades. But tonight felt different. Tonight I was going to sleep knowing that I had finally stood up for myself, that I had chosen my own dignity over their comfort. Tomorrow, I would wake up as Joan Roberts, the woman who knew her worth. And that was a beautiful way to begin whatever time I had left. The weeks following my decision to change the will passed with a strange serenity I hadn't felt in years. I established new routines that didn't revolve around checking my phone for messages that never came, or making excuses for children who couldn't be bothered to make time for their mother. Instead, I focused on the things that brought me genuine joy. I started volunteering at the public library twice a week, helping elderly patrons navigate the computer systems, and reading to children during story time. There was something healing about being around people who appreciated my presence, who smiled when they saw me coming, who remembered my name and asked about my weekend. "Mrs. Patterson, an 87-year-old regular who came in every Tuesday for large print mysteries, became particularly dear to me. She had outlived 2 husbands and all 3 of her siblings, but she faced each day with a dignity that inspired me. When I told her I was thinking about taking up painting, she clapped her hands together like I had announced I was going to climb Mount Everest. "Joan, that's wonderful!" she exclaimed. "Life's too short to spend it waiting for other people to make us happy. We have to make our own happiness." Her words stayed with me as I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. The instructor, a patient woman named Elena who couldn't have been more than 30, treated each of us seniors like we were capable of creating masterpieces. In the gentle focus of mixing colors and learning to control the flow of paint on paper, I found a meditation I didn't know I needed. I painted landscapes mostly, trying to capture the way morning light hit the mountains I could see from my bedroom window, or the way shadows fell across my garden in the late afternoon. I wasn't good at it, but that wasn't the point. The point was the hour and a half twice a week when my mind was completely occupied with something beautiful, something mine. It was during my 4th painting class that I met Dorothy Chen, a retired nurse who had moved to Millbrook after her husband's death to be closer to her sister. Dorothy was funny and irreverent. With steel gray hair she wore in a no-nonsense bob and a laugh that could fill a room. When she discovered that I lived alone, she appointed herself my social coordinator. "Joan, you're too young to be a hermit," she announced one Thursday after class. "I'm taking you to lunch." Lunch turned into a weekly tradition. Dorothy had a gift for asking questions that made me think, and she listened to my answers without trying to fix me or offer unwanted advice. When I told her about changing my will, she nodded thoughtfully. "My daughter lives in Seattle," she said, stirring her soup. "She calls every Sunday like clockwork. Has for 10 years. But you know what? Those calls feel like obligation, not love. She's checking a box, making sure she can't be accused of neglecting her mother. Sometimes I think I'd rather have no calls at all than calls that feel like charity." Her honesty was refreshing. So many people my age spent their time making excuses for their children's neglect, as if admitting disappointment was a betrayal of motherhood itself. "Do you regret having children?" I asked her one afternoon as we sat in the park feeding ducks. Dorothy considered this seriously. "No," she said finally. "I loved raising my daughter. Those early years were some of the happiest of my life. But I regret thinking that giving someone life means they owe you theirs. I regret not teaching her that love is a choice you make every day, not a debt you pay off once and consider settled." These conversations with Dorothy became a lifeline I didn't know I needed. She helped me see that my decision wasn't vindictive or petty. It was self-preservation. October arrived with its usual fanfare of changing leaves and crisp mornings. I was deadheading chrysanthemums in my front garden when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. I looked up to see Jennifer walking toward me, her artist's bag slung over her shoulder and an expression on her face I couldn't quite read. "Hi, Mom," she said, stopping a few feet away like she wasn't sure of her welcome. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, pulling off my gardening gloves. "This is a surprise." She shifted her weight from foot to foot, a gesture I remembered from her childhood when she was working up the courage to confess some misdeed. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, though we both knew that was unlikely. "I thought maybe we could talk." I gestured toward the porch chairs. "Of course. Can I get you some tea?" "That would be nice." I made a pot of chamomile tea and brought it out on the tray that had been a wedding gift 38 years ago. Jennifer had settled into the chair where her father used to sit when we were still married, still pretending to be a family. "Mom," she began after I'd poured the tea, "I've been thinking a lot lately about us, about our relationship." I waited, knowing that whatever she was about to say had been rehearsed. I know I haven't been the best daughter. I know I've been self-absorbed and busy and maybe not as attentive as I should be. Still, I waited. "And I know I forgot your birthday again this year." I felt terrible when I realized it. I still feel terrible. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. She took a sip of tea and looked out at the garden where I'd taught her to plant seeds when she was small enough to need a step stool to reach the raised beds. "The thing is, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be better at staying in touch without it feeling forced or artificial." Her honesty surprised me. "What do you mean?" I mean, if I start calling you every week because I feel guilty about forgetting your birthday, that's not really about loving you. That's about managing my own guilt. And I don't want our relationship to be based on my guilt. I set down my teacup and studied my youngest daughter's face. She had grown into a beautiful woman, with my mother's high cheekbones and her father's stubborn chin. But there was something else there now. Something that looked like wisdom. "What do you want it to be based on?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "I want it to be real," she said finally. "I want to call you because I miss your voice, not because the calendar tells me I should. I want to visit because I enjoy your company, not because I'm fulfilling an obligation." "And how do we get there?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe we start over. Maybe we figure out who we are to each other, now that I'm grown up, and you're not responsible for raising me anymore." I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of muscles I didn't realize had been clenched. "I'd like that," I said. We talked for another hour, carefully at first, then with growing ease. She told me about a painting she was working on, a portrait of an elderly woman in her garden that had been inspired by seeing me in mine. I told her about my watercolor class and how liberating it felt to be bad at something without caring about improving. When she left, she hugged me differently than she had in years. Not the perfunctory embrace of duty, but the real holding that happens between people who are choosing to love each other. After her car disappeared down the street, I sat on the porch as the sun set and thought about the conversation. Jennifer's visit didn't change my decision about the will. If anything, it confirmed that I had been right to force a reckoning. Sometimes people need to feel the possibility of loss before they understand the value of what they have. But it did give me hope that perhaps our relationship could become something authentic, something chosen rather than assumed. That was worth more to me than any inheritance could ever be worth to her. November brought the first snow and an unexpected phone call from Sarah. She was crying before I even said hello. "Mom!" she sobbed into the phone. "Craig left me." I felt the old maternal instincts surge forward, the desire to fix and comfort and make everything better. But I held myself back and simply listened as she told me about finding the texts, the confrontation, the lawyer consultations. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she finished. "I feel so lost." "I'm sorry you're going through this," I said, and I meant it. "That must be incredibly painful." "Can I come home for a while?" she asked. "Just until I figure things out?" Home. She still thought of this place as home, even though she'd lived in Denver for 15 years and visited maybe once a year. "Of course," I said. "You're always welcome here." She arrived 3 days later, with 2 suitcases and her children, Emma and Jack, who barely remembered their grandmother but were excited about the adventure of staying in a new place. Emma was 12, all elbows and attitude, and Jack was 9, gap-toothed and curious about everything. Having children in the house again was both wonderful and exhausting. I had forgotten how much energy they required, how their needs organized the entire day, around meals and homework and baths and bedtime stories. But I had also forgotten the sweetness of Jack climbing into my lap to hear about my day, or Emma helping me make cookies while she told me about the drama in her 7th grade class. Sarah, meanwhile, was a wreck. She alternated between fierce anger at Craig and desperate grief over the end of her marriage. She slept until noon, then stayed up until 3 in the morning making phone calls to lawyers and friends and her therapist. She was like a teenager again, all raw emotion and poor decisions. But something remarkable happened during those weeks. Away from the pressure of maintaining her perfect life in Denver, Sarah started to remember who she used to be. She helped me decorate for Christmas the way we had when she was young, stringing lights and making paper snowflakes with her children. She cooked dinner most nights, experimenting with recipes she found online and laughing when they turned out badly. One evening, as we cleaned up after a particularly disastrous attempt at homemade pizza, she stopped drying dishes and looked at me. "Mom," she said, "I'm sorry about your birthday, about all of them." I continued washing plates, giving her space to say what she needed to say. I got so caught up in trying to look successful that I forgot what actually matters. I scheduled my life so tightly That there wasn't room for spontaneity or thoughtfulness or just calling because I wanted to hear your voice. Why did you feel like you had to look successful? I asked. She considered this. Because you sacrificed so much for us. Because you worked so hard to give us opportunities you never had. I felt like if I wasn't constantly achieving, constantly moving forward, I was wasting your sacrifice. I turned to face her, dish towel in hand. Sarah, my love, the best way to honor my sacrifice is to be happy. To be a good person. To show kindness to others. I never needed you to be perfect. I just needed you to remember that I love you. She started crying then, and I held her the way I had when she was small, and the world felt too big and scary to navigate alone. Sarah and the children stayed through Christmas, and it was the best holiday I'd had in years. We established new traditions mixed with old ones, and I watched my grandchildren discover the joy of a grandmother who had time and attention to give them. When they finally returned to Denver in January, Sarah promised to call every Sunday, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to stay connected to the peace she'd found in my kitchen. But promises are easy to make and hard to keep, especially when life gets complicated again. By March, the Sunday calls had dwindled to every other week, then once a month, then whenever she remembered. Sarah was dating someone new, rebuilding her life, and once again I became an afterthought. The disappointment stung, but it was different this time. I had seen behind the curtain of her perfectionism, understood the pressure she put on herself, felt the genuine love underneath her neglect. I still didn't change my will, but I did change my expectations. Instead of waiting for her to be the daughter I wanted, I accepted her as the daughter she was. Michael, meanwhile, remained a mystery to me. He called on major holidays, sent expensive flowers for Mother's Day, and continued to keep me at arm's length from his real life. Brenda posted pictures on social media of family gatherings I wasn't invited to, vacations I didn't know they were taking, milestones I learned about secondhand. When I turned 73 in September, I didn't wait to see if they would remember. I planned my own celebration. Dorothy and I drove to New York City for a long weekend, seeing shows and eating at restaurants and walking through museums until our feet hurt. It was exactly the kind of birthday I wanted, full of beauty and friendship and new experiences. None of my children called. This time, it didn't break me. It confirmed what I already knew, that they were capable of love but not capable of the kind of consistent, thoughtful love that sustains relationships over time. That wasn't a reflection of my worth as a mother or as a person. It was simply who they were. When I returned from New York, I found a message from Harold on my answering machine. He was updating his files and wanted to confirm that I hadn't changed my mind about the will. I called him back and told him I was more certain than ever. "Joan," he said, "I have to ask one more time. Are you sure you don't want to leave them anything? Even a small token? Something symbolic?" I thought about this seriously. "Harold, I'm leaving them the most valuable thing I can give them, the consequences of their choices. Maybe that will teach them something I couldn't." That night, I sat in my garden with a cup of tea and watched the fireflies dance in the September darkness. In the distance, I could hear the neighbors' children playing in their backyard, their laughter carried on the warm air. I thought about the family I had tried so hard to create, and the family I had actually raised, and the woman I had become in the space between those two realities. I was proud of that woman. She had learned to value herself. She had learned to create her own happiness. She had learned that love is not an endless resource that can be taken for granted, but a gift that must be treasured and reciprocated. My children would learn these lessons too, eventually. But they would learn them without my inheritance, and that was exactly as it should be. Some teachings can only happen through loss, and some love can only be understood in its absence. I finished my tea and went inside, turning off lights and checking locks, comfortable in the knowledge that I had chosen my own worth over their comfort. It was the best gift I could give any of us. The morning after my 74th birthday came and went without acknowledgement. I woke with a clarity that surprised me. There was no sadness, no anger, just a cool understanding that this was exactly what I had expected. 4 years now. 4 consecutive birthdays erased from their memories, like I had never been born at all. I made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten countless meals alone, watching the October sun paint golden squares across the worn linoleum. The house felt different somehow, lighter, as if the weight of expectations had finally lifted from its foundation. I had stopped waiting for love that would never come, and in that stopping, I had found something unexpected. Freedom. My phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy asking if I wanted to go antiquing in Lancaster County. I smiled and typed back yes, realizing that this was what my life looked like now. Friends who remembered what brought me joy. Plans that existed for pleasure rather than obligation. Days shaped by my own desires instead of other people's neglect. As I got dressed for my outing with Dorothy, I caught sight of myself in the bedroom mirror. 74 years old, silver hair that I'd finally stopped coloring, laugh lines earned through decades of finding reasons to smile despite disappointment. I looked like a woman who had learned something important about herself. I looked like a woman who had chosen dignity over desperation. Dorothy picked me up in her ancient Buick, that she insisted ran better than cars half its age. We drove through the countryside with the windows down, talking about everything and nothing, stopping at farm stands for apple cider and small antique shops where we browsed through other people's memories. In one shop, I found a music box with a tiny ballerina that reminded me of Jennifer when she was 5, twirling around the living room in a pink tutu I'd sewn myself. For a moment, I felt the familiar pull of nostalgia, the urge to buy it and send it to her with a note about the memory. But then I set it back on the shelf. Those sweet memories belonged to a different woman, a different mother, a different family. I was building something new now. "You're changing," Dorothy observed as we drove home, her hands steady on the wheel despite her 78 years. "How so?" "You're not carrying their weight anymore. You used to talk about Michael and Sarah and Jennifer like they were burdens you were responsible for, even though they're grown adults with their own lives. Now you talk about them like people you used to know." She was right. Somewhere in the past year, I had stopped feeling responsible for their happiness, their choices, their failures to connect. I had stopped being their mother in the exhausting way I'd been their mother for decades, and started being Joan Roberts, a woman who happened to have given birth to 3 people who were now strangers. That evening, I called Harold to discuss the final details of my estate planning. We went over the scholarship fund I was establishing, now named the Joan Roberts Foundation for Single Mothers in Education. I had decided to fund it with 70% of my assets, keeping enough to live comfortably for whatever years remained but ensuring that women facing the challenges I had faced would have opportunities I never had. "The paperwork is almost complete," Harold told me. "The foundation will be administered by the community college, and they're thrilled to have such a substantial endowment. You're going to change a lot of lives, Joan." After hanging up, I sat in my living room with a photo album Dorothy had encouraged me to create, not of family memories that brought pain, but of the life I'd built for myself in recent years. Pictures from my painting classes, the volunteer work at the library, trips with Dorothy, quiet moments in my garden. A life measured not by other people's presence, but by my own contentment. November arrived with an early snowfall that transformed the neighborhood into something magical. I was shoveling my front walk when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A woman in her 30s stepped out, bundled in an expensive wool coat, and walked toward me with the careful steps of someone wearing heels on ice. "Mrs. Roberts?" she asked. "I'm Amanda Sullivan, from Sullivan Communications. I was hoping we could talk." I leaned on my shovel and studied her face. She had the polished look of someone who worked in public relations or marketing, all straight teeth and careful makeup. "What can I do for you?" "I represent Michael Roberts. Your son. He's hired our firm to help with a family matter." The audacity of it took my breath away. Michael had hired strangers to approach his own mother, rather than picking up the phone himself. "I'm not interested in whatever he's paying you to say," I told her. "Mrs. Roberts, please, could we just go inside for a few minutes? Michael is very concerned about your well-being, and he'd like to help resolve whatever misunderstanding has come between you." Misunderstanding? As if 4 years of forgotten birthdays were some kind of communication error that could be cleared up with the right explanation. "There's no misunderstanding," I said. "Michael knows exactly what the problem is. If he wants to talk to me, he has my phone number." Amanda looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight in her inappropriate shoes. "He's tried calling, but you haven't returned his messages." This was news to me. I checked my answering machine religiously and hadn't received any calls from Michael in months. "When did he call?" She consulted her phone. Yesterday, around 10 in the morning. He left a voicemail explaining that he wanted to discuss some concerns he has about your recent legal activities. Legal activities. Someone had told him about the will change. My stomach tightened as I realized that Harold's office must have had a security breach, or someone had been asking questions they shouldn't have been asking. How does Michael know about my legal activities? I asked. Amanda's composure slipped slightly. I'm not privy to all the details. I was simply asked to reach out and see if we could facilitate a conversation. The answer is no. Please leave my property. I turned away from her and continued shoveling, listening to the sound of her careful footsteps retreating to her car. As she drove away, I felt a familiar anger building in my chest. Even now, even after years of neglect, Michael couldn't be bothered to approach me directly. He sent hired representatives like I was a business problem to be managed, rather than the woman who had raised him. That evening, I checked my answering machine and found no messages from Michael or anyone else. Either Amanda had been lying about the attempted call, or Michael's definition of trying was as half-hearted as everything else he did when it came to our relationship. I called Harold immediately. Joan, I was just about to call you, he said, his voice tense. We have a problem. Someone told Michael about the will. Worse than that. Someone called claiming to be you, asking for copies of your estate documents. My secretary, bless her, followed protocol and refused to release anything without proper identification. But then we started getting calls from a law firm in Chicago claiming to represent your son. They're asking questions about your mental competency. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. My mental competency? They're not filing anything yet, as far as I know. But Joan, they're positioning for a challenge. If they can prove that you weren't of sound mind when you changed your will, they can contest it after your death. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair, my hands shaking. Can they do that? Can they really claim I'm mentally incompetent because I chose not to leave them my money? They can try. And sometimes these challenges succeed, especially if the deceased had any documented history of depression, medication use, or cognitive decline. Have you been seeing any doctors recently? Taking any medications that might affect your judgment? I thought about my recent physical, the mild blood pressure medication I'd been prescribed, the brief conversation with my doctor about feeling isolated. I'm on medication for high blood pressure. And I mentioned to Dr. Martinez that I was feeling lonely. But Harold, I'm sharper now than I've been in years. I'm making clearer decisions, thinking more rationally. Changing my will wasn't a moment of confusion. It was the sanest thing I've done in decades. I believe you, Joan, but we need to be prepared. I'm going to recommend that you see a neuropsychologist for a cognitive assessment. If Michael and his lawyers are planning to challenge your mental state, we need documentation that proves you're fully competent. After hanging up with Harold, I sat in my kitchen as darkness fell around me, trying to process what was happening. My own son was preparing to challenge my sanity because I had dared to value myself. He couldn't be bothered to remember my birthday, but he could hire lawyers to question my mental fitness when he discovered that neglect had consequences. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I called Dorothy, needing to hear a friendly voice. Joan, what's wrong? You sound shaken. I told her everything about Amanda's visit, Harold's call, the apparent legal challenge being prepared against me. Those bastards, Dorothy said when I finished. They ignore you for years, then suddenly care deeply about your well-being when money is involved. What if they succeed, Dorothy? What if some judge decides that a woman who changes her will must be mentally incompetent? Then we fight them, Dorothy said firmly. Joan, you're one of the most rational, thoughtful people I know. Any honest assessment will prove that. And if your children want to spend their inheritance on lawyers trying to prove their mother is crazy, that tells the world everything they need to know about their character. Her words steadied me, but I spent most of that night awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how my family had become my enemy. When had love turned into a legal battle? When had my children decided that my money was more important than my dignity? The next morning, I called Dr. Martinez and scheduled an appointment to discuss the situation. She listened carefully as I explained what was happening, occasionally taking notes. Joan, in my professional opinion, you're exhibiting signs of mental clarity and emotional health, not cognitive decline. The fact that you've recognized unhealthy family dynamics and taken steps to protect yourself shows excellent judgment. But they're going to argue that changing my will proves I'm not thinking clearly. People change their wills all the time for perfectly rational reasons. You've documented years of neglect from your children. You've made thoughtful decisions about alternative beneficiaries. This isn't the behavior of someone who's mentally incompetent. This is the behavior of someone who's finally prioritizing her own well-being. Dr. Martinez referred me to Dr. Patricia Henning, a neuropsychologist who specialized in cognitive assessments for legal purposes. I made an appointment for the following week, feeling like I was preparing for battle. In the meantime, I tried to maintain my normal routine. I went to my painting class, volunteered at the library, tended my garden as winter approached. But underneath the ordinary activities, I felt the stress of being watched, judged, evaluated by children who had never bothered to truly see me. The cognitive assessment with Dr. Henning was thorough and exhausting. She tested my memory, reasoning skills, decision-making abilities, and emotional stability through a series of exercises that lasted nearly 4 hours. I answered questions about my life, my relationships, my motivations for changing the will. "Mrs. Roberts," she said at the end of the session, "I want you to know that you've performed exceptionally well on all measures. Your cognitive function is well above average for your age group. Your reasoning is clear, your memory is sharp, and your emotional responses are entirely appropriate to the circumstances you've described. So I'm not crazy for protecting myself from people who don't value me?" Dr. Henning smiled. "You're not crazy at all. You're a woman who has recognized toxic relationships and made healthy choices to distance yourself from them. That's not mental illness. That's wisdom." Her report, when it was completed, was 20 pages of detailed analysis, proving that Joan Roberts was not only mentally competent but demonstrating exceptional emotional intelligence in managing difficult family relationships. Armed with this documentation, Harold felt confident that any legal challenge would fail. But the knowledge that my children were prepared to publicly question my sanity changed something fundamental in how I saw them. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. December arrived with its usual promises of family togetherness and holiday joy, neither of which held any appeal for me anymore. I decorated my house modestly, more for my own pleasure than for any visitors I might receive. I bought gifts for Dorothy and a few other friends. Planned a quiet Christmas that didn't revolve around people who had made it clear I wasn't a priority in their lives. On December 15th, exactly 3 months after my forgotten birthday, Michael finally called. "Mom," he said when I answered, his voice careful and formal. "We need to talk." "Hello, Michael. It's been a while." "I know, and I'm sorry about that. Things have been busy. But I'm calling because I'm concerned about some decisions you've been making lately." "What decisions?" "Well, changing your will, for one thing, and cutting us out of your estate. Mom, that's not like you." I felt a cold anger settle in my chest. How is it not like me, Michael? You've always been family-oriented. You've always put us first. This seems so vindictive. Vindictive. Because protecting myself from neglect was vindictive. "Michael, when was the last time you called me?" Silence. "When was the last time you visited?" More silence. "When was my birthday this year?" "Mom, I know I haven't been the best about staying in touch." "September 15th, I interrupted. "My birthday was September 15th. I turned 74. You didn't call. You didn't send a card. You didn't acknowledge my existence." For the 4th year in a row. "I meant to call. Time just got away from me." "Time got away from you. For 4 years. But you found time to hire a public relations firm to approach me when you discovered I'd changed my will. How did you know about that?" "Because Amanda Sullivan came to my house, Michael. Because you couldn't be bothered to call your own mother, but you could pay strangers to manage our relationship." I heard him take a deep breath. "Mom, I think you're being unreasonable. Yes, I've been busy. Yes, I should have called more. But that doesn't mean you should cut us out of your inheritance entirely." "My inheritance," I repeated. "Not our relationship. not your concern for my well-being. My inheritance. That's not what I meant. That's exactly what you meant. You don't care about having a relationship with me, Michael. You care about maintaining access to my money. That's not fair. What's not fair is spending 43 years raising children who think love is a one-way transaction. What's not fair is being treated like an obligation when it's convenient and ignored when it's not. We don't ignore you. You forgot my birthday 4 years in a row. You hired lawyers to question my mental competency rather than having an honest conversation about why I might be disappointed in you. If that's not ignoring me, what would you call it? Another long silence. Mom, I'm willing to make changes, we all are. Sarah wants to call you more often. Jennifer has been talking about visiting for Christmas. We can do better? Now that you know your inheritance is at stake, that's not why we want to reconnect. Michael, if you had wanted to reconnect, you would have done it already. You've had 4 years of birthdays you could have remembered. You've had hundreds of days you could have picked up the phone. You chose not to. The only thing that's changed is your financial motivation. I heard him talking to someone in the background, probably Brenda, probably getting coaching on what to say next. Mom, what if we came for Christmas? What if we spent some real time together? Worked on rebuilding our relationship? To prove I should change my will back? To prove we love you? Michael, I'm 74 years old. I don't have time left to waste on people who need a financial incentive to love me. So that's it? You're just giving up on us? I gave up on you the night I sat alone on my 72nd birthday, waiting for a phone call that never came. I gave up on you when you hired strangers to approach me, rather than apologizing yourself. I gave up on you when you had lawyers investigate my mental health, rather than examining your own behavior. We can change, Mom. We want to change. Good. Change for your own sake, for your own relationships, for your own children. But don't change for my money. Because you're not getting it. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of my kitchen, shaking with adrenaline and grief, and something that felt like relief. I had said everything I needed to say. I had drawn the line clearly. There would be no more negotiations, no more chances, no more hoping that they would suddenly become the children I had raised them to be. The next few days brought a flurry of activity. Sarah called twice, crying and apologetic. Jennifer sent a long email explaining how busy she'd been with work and promising to do better. Even Brenda, Michael's wife, left a voicemail expressing her concern for my well-being and suggesting family therapy. I didn't respond to any of them, not because I was trying to punish them, but because I finally understood that their sudden attention wasn't about love. It was about money, and I was too old and too tired to pretend otherwise. Instead, I spent my energy on things that brought me genuine joy. I finished a watercolor painting of my winter garden that actually looked like what I had intended. I read 3 mystery novels in a week, staying up late because I could, sleeping in because I wanted to. I planned a New Year's trip to Florida with Dorothy, our first airplane adventure together. On Christmas Eve, I attended midnight mass at the little church where I'd been married 38 years ago. I sat in the back pew, listening to carols I'd sung as a child, watching families gather together in the pews around me. Some of those families looked genuinely happy to be together. Others looked like they were fulfilling obligations, going through motions without feeling. I had spent so many years in the second category, trying to force love that didn't exist naturally, creating false togetherness through guilt and manipulation and tradition. Now I was alone, but I was free. Free from expectations that would never be met. Free from hoping for love that would never come. Free from measuring my worth by other people's attention. As I walked home through the quiet streets, snow beginning to fall in fat, lazy flakes, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. I was Joan Roberts, a woman who knew her value. I was Joan Roberts, who had chosen dignity over desperation. I was Joan Roberts, who had finally learned that some relationships are worth ending, and some love isn't worth keeping. The house was warm when I returned, lit by the small Christmas tree I'd decorated for my own pleasure. I made myself a cup of hot chocolate and sat by the tree, watching the lights twinkle in the darkness outside. Tomorrow would be Christmas, and I would spend it exactly as I chose, surrounded by people who valued my presence rather than my presence. It was going to be the best Christmas I'd had in years. The new year brought with it a freedom I hadn't felt since I was young, and the world seemed full of endless possibilities. Dorothy and I returned from our Florida trip tanned and laughing, armed with stories of midnight shuffleboard tournaments and early morning beach walks, where we solved the world's problems one conversation at a time. I had bought myself a bright coral dress that the sales lady said brought out my eyes, and for the first time in years I felt beautiful in my own skin. January in Pennsylvania was brutal that year, with snow that seemed to fall daily and temperatures that kept most sensible people indoors. But I found myself energized by the cold, invigorated by the way the winter light slanted through my kitchen windows each morning as I planned my day. I had signed up for a pottery class at the community center, finally ready to try something that required me to get my hands dirty and embrace the possibility of failure. The pottery studio was in the basement of the community center, a warm, cluttered space that smelled of clay and creativity. Our instructor was a woman named Rosa, who had taught middle school art for 30 years before retiring to pursue her own ceramic work. She had the patience of someone who had spent decades helping awkward adolescents discover their artistic voices, and she treated our group of mostly older beginners with the same gentle encouragement. I loved everything about working with clay. The way it felt cool and responsive under my hands, the meditative rhythm of centering it on the wheel, the dozens of ways a simple bowl could go wrong before it went right. My first attempts were disasters, lopsided vessels that collapsed under their own ambitious heights. But Rosa reminded us that every potter had made thousands of terrible pots before making their first good one, and that the only way to fail was to stop trying. On a particularly cold Thursday in February, I was wrestling with what I hoped would become a vase when another student, a man about my age with paint-stained fingers and kind eyes, asked if he could share my wedging board. "I'm Thomas," he said, introducing himself as he began working his clay. "Tommy, actually. I've been meaning to introduce myself for weeks, but I always seem to be covered in more clay than is dignified for first meetings." I laughed, looking down at my own clay-covered apron. "I'm Joan, and I think dignity is overrated when you're learning something new." Tommy had started pottery after his wife died 2 years earlier, he told me as we worked side by side. He'd been a high school principal for 35 years, spent his retirement traveling with Margaret, and then suddenly found himself alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. Pottery had been Margaret's hobby, and he'd taken it up partly to feel connected to her memory, and partly because he needed something to do with his hands that wasn't watching television or reading the same newspaper articles twice. "Do your children worry about you taking classes with strangers?" I asked, curious about his family situation. Tommy smiled ruefully. "My daughter calls every day to check on me. She's convinced I'm going to fall and break a hip or get scammed by someone who targets lonely widowers. She means well, but sometimes I feel like I'm being managed rather than loved." I understood that feeling completely. At least she calls every day. True. Though there are days I wouldn't mind if she trusted me to take care of myself for 24 hours without supervision. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the hum of the pottery wheels and the soft conversations of other students. When class ended, Tommy offered to help me carry my latest disaster to the drying shelves. "Joan," he said as we cleaned up our workspace, "would you like to get coffee sometime? Somewhere that doesn't require us to wash clay off our hands first?" I hesitated for just a moment, not because I wasn't interested, but because it had been so long since a man had asked me to coffee that I'd forgotten how to respond gracefully. "I'd like that," I said finally. "Saturday morning? There's a little place downtown that makes excellent scones." Saturday sounds perfect. As I drove home that evening, I found myself smiling at the unexpected turn my day had taken. Not because I was looking for romance, but because someone had seen me as Joan the person, not Joan the neglected mother, or Joan the woman whose children were questioning her sanity. Tommy didn't know about my family drama, didn't have any agenda beyond enjoying my company. There was something refreshing about being just myself with someone new. Saturday morning arrived crisp and bright, and I spent longer than usual getting ready. I chose a blue sweater that Dorothy had insisted brought out my eyes, and took extra care with my hair. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Tommy was already there, reading a paperback novel and looking comfortable in his own skin. "Philip Roth," he said, holding up the book when he saw me approaching. "Margaret always said I read too much depressing literature, but I think Roth understands something important about getting older." Which is that most of life is just showing up and trying to do better than you did yesterday. We talked for 2 hours, covering everything from books to travel to the challenges of learning new skills in our 70s. Tommy had a way of listening that made me feel heard, and when I mentioned that I'd been having some family difficulties lately, he didn't push for details. Family can be complicated, he said simply. Sometimes, the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who have the hardest time seeing us clearly. After coffee, he walked me to my car, and when he asked if I'd like to have dinner the following weekend, I didn't hesitate. I know a little Italian place that's been here since the 1950s, he said. The kind of place where they remember your usual order after 2 visits. That sounds wonderful. As I drove home, I realized that I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. Having something to look forward to that had nothing to do with my children or their opinions felt like a small miracle. The dinner with Tommy was even better than coffee had been. The restaurant was exactly as he'd described, a family-owned place with checkered tablecloths and photographs of Italy covering every wall. The owner, a man in his 60s who had inherited the restaurant from his father, treated Tommy like family and welcomed me with the kind of warmth that made me feel like I belonged there. Over plates of homemade pasta and a bottle of Chianti that Tommy insisted we split, I found myself telling him about my painting classes, my volunteer work at the library, my friendship with Dorothy. I talked about the woman I was becoming, rather than the woman I had been, and Tommy listened with genuine interest. You sound like someone who's figured out how to be happy, he observed, as we shared a piece of tiramisu for dessert. I'm learning, I said. It's taken me longer than it should have, but I'm finally understanding that happiness is something you create, not something you wait for other people to give you. Margaret used to say that the secret to a good life was knowing the difference between what you can control and what you can't, and putting all your energy into the first category. Your wife sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. And I think she would have liked you. The compliment warmed me more than the wine had. When Tommy walked me to my car again, he asked if I'd like to go to the art museum the following Saturday. They have a new exhibition of American Impressionists that I've been wanting to see, he said, and I could use someone with an artist's eye to help me understand what I'm looking at. I'm hardly an artist, but I'd love to go. That night, I fell asleep thinking about the way Tommy had looked at me across the dinner table, like I was someone worth knowing. It had been so long since I'd felt seen by another person that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. March arrived with the first hints of spring, and my relationship with Tommy settled into a comfortable rhythm. We saw each other twice a week, sometimes for dinner, sometimes for walks in the park, once for a concert at the local college where we felt ancient compared to the other audience members, but young in our shared appreciation for the music. Tommy never pushed for more intimacy than I was ready to give, never asked probing questions about my family situation, never made me feel like I owed him explanations for the choices I'd made. He was simply present in the way that felt like a gift after years of relationships built on guilt and obligation. I was arranging flowers from my garden one afternoon in early April when the phone rang. The caller ID showed Jennifer's name, and I debated whether to answer. We hadn't spoken since her Christmas email, and I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever conversation she wanted to have. "Hi, Mom," she said when I finally picked up. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "I was just arranging some daffodils. Spring came early this year. Mom, I've been thinking a lot about us lately. About everything that's happened. And I wondered if we could meet somewhere and talk. Really talk." I set down the flowers and sat at the kitchen table. "What did you want to talk about?" "About how I've been as a daughter. About what I can do to fix things between us. About whether there's still a chance for us to have a real relationship." Her voice sounded different somehow, less rehearsed than it had during our previous conversations. There was something raw in it that made me think this might be genuine rather than strategic. "Where did you want to meet?" "Anywhere you want. I could come to the house, or we could meet somewhere neutral. Whatever would be most comfortable for you." I thought about it. Meeting at the house felt too intimate, too weighted with history. But I also didn't want the pressure of a public place, where we might feel obligated to keep our voices down. There's a park about halfway between here and Philadelphia, Riverside Park in Conshohocken. Do you know it? I'll find it. When? Saturday afternoon, around 2? I'll be there. And Mom? Thank you for giving me this chance. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, watching the daffodils brighten in their simple glass vase. I wasn't sure what Jennifer wanted to say, but something in her voice had sounded like the daughter I remembered from years ago, before life got complicated and relationships became transactions. I called Dorothy to tell her about the planned meeting. "How do you feel about it?" she asked. Nervous, hopeful, suspicious, all at the same time. That sounds about right. Just remember, Joan, you don't owe her anything. If she wants to rebuild your relationship, the work has to come from her, not from you making yourself smaller to accommodate her comfort. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of spring day that couldn't decide what season it wanted to be. I arrived at Riverside Park a few minutes early and chose a bench near the playground where we could have privacy but wouldn't feel completely isolated. Jennifer's car pulled into the parking lot exactly at 2, and I watched her walk toward me with the same nervous energy I remembered from her childhood when she had something important to say. She looked older than I remembered, with new lines around her eyes and gray threads in her dark hair that she hadn't bothered to color. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, no makeup, like she had decided to show up as herself, rather than the polished version of herself she usually presented to the world. "Hi, Mom," she said, settling onto the bench beside me. "Thank you for coming. You sounded like you had something important to say." Jennifer was quiet for a moment, watching a young father push his toddler on the swings nearby. "I've been in therapy," she said finally. "Since Christmas. Trying to figure out why all my relationships feel so superficial. Why I always feel like I'm performing instead of connecting." I didn't say anything, just waited for her to continue. "And we've been talking a lot about family patterns, about the way I learned to relate to people, about you. What about me? About how I've treated you, about how selfish I've been, about how I've taken your love for granted because I knew it would always be there, no matter how badly I behaved." Jennifer turned to face me, and I could see tears in her eyes. "Mom, I know I forgot your birthday. 4 years in a row. I know that's unforgivable." "It's not about forgiveness, Jennifer. It's about understanding what those forgotten birthdays represent." "What do they represent?" "That I don't matter to you. That my existence in your life is so peripheral that you don't even register the day I was born. That after everything I sacrificed to raise you, I've become invisible." She was crying now, not the pretty tears of someone trying to manipulate a situation, but the ugly, honest tears of someone confronting an uncomfortable truth. "I never meant to make you feel invisible. But you did, for years. And when I finally decided to protect myself by changing my will, instead of examining why I might have done that, you and your brothers hired lawyers to question my sanity. I didn't know about that. Michael didn't tell me he was doing that until after it was already happening. But you didn't object, did you? You didn't tell him it was wrong to treat your mother that way. Number I didn't. And I should have." We sat in silence for a while, watching the drizzle turn the playground equipment dark with moisture. Finally, Jennifer spoke again. "Mom, I know I have no right to ask this, but is there any way we can start over? Not pretend the past didn't happen, but try to build something real going forward? What would that look like?" "I don't know yet, but I want to find out. I want to call you because I miss your voice, not because I feel guilty. I want to visit because I enjoy your company, not because I'm fulfilling an obligation. I want to know who you are now, not just remember who you were when I was a child." I studied my youngest daughter's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. But all I saw was someone who looked as tired of pretending as I was. "Jennifer, I need you to understand something. Even if we manage to rebuild our relationship, I'm not changing my will back. The scholarship fund, the donations to charity, all of that stays the same. I know, and I don't care about the money. I mean, of course I would have appreciated inheriting something from you someday, but I care more about having you in my life than having your assets. And if Michael and Sarah don't feel the same way, if they continue to fight me legally or pressure you to change my mind, then I'll deal with that when it happens. But my relationship with you isn't contingent on theirs. I felt something shift in my chest. A small loosening of muscles I didn't realize had been clenched. All right. We can try. But it has to be real, Jennifer. I won't go back to being the mother who makes excuses for her children's neglect. I understand. And Mom? I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. It took courage to change your will, to refuse to be taken for granted anymore. I wish I had learned that lesson from watching you instead of forcing you to teach it this way. We talked for another hour, carefully at first, then with growing ease. Jennifer told me about her therapy sessions, about the patterns she was learning to recognize in her relationships. I told her about my pottery classes, about Tommy, about the life I was building that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother. When we finally parted, Jennifer hugged me in a way that felt different from the perfunctory embraces of the past. This felt like the beginning of something authentic rather than the maintenance of something obligatory. "Can I call you next week?" she asked. Not because it's Mother's Day or your birthday or some other calendar reminder, but just because I want to hear how you're doing. I'd like that. As I drove home, I found myself cautiously optimistic about Jennifer. She seemed genuinely committed to change, to building something real between us. Whether that would last remained to be seen, but for the first time in years I felt like one of my children was actually seeing me as a person rather than a role. May brought warm weather and the kind of spring beauty that made Pennsylvania feel like paradise. My garden was exploding with color, the daffodils giving way to tulips and then to the early roses that had been my pride for decades. Tommy had started coming over on Sunday mornings to help with the heavier garden work, and we'd developed a comfortable routine of working together in comfortable silence, then sitting on the back porch with coffee and the Sunday crossword puzzle. Jennifer had been true to her word about calling regularly, and our conversations were getting easier. She told me about her art, her students, her therapy revelations. I told her about my pottery progress, my volunteer work, my growing friendship with Tommy. We were learning to know each other as adults, and I was surprised to discover that I actually liked the woman my daughter was becoming. Michael and Sarah, however, remained silent. No more hired intermediaries, no more threatening phone calls, no more attempts at manipulation. I wondered if they had finally accepted that their inheritance was gone, or if they were simply regrouping for another assault on my decision. The answer came on a Tuesday morning in late May, when Harold called with news that made my blood run cold. "Joan, I need to see you today if possible. Michael's lawyers have filed a formal challenge to your will. They're claiming undue influence and diminished capacity." Undue influence? From whom? "They're alleging that Jennifer and your friend Dorothy have manipulated you into changing your will to benefit causes they support, rather than your natural heirs. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it hadn't been so vicious. Jennifer, who had explicitly told me she didn't care about the money. Dorothy, who had encouraged me to value myself but had never once mentioned my financial decisions. What do we do now? We fight. And fortunately, we're well prepared. Dr. Henning's cognitive assessment will be crucial, and I've been documenting every attempt your children have made to contact you since you changed the will. Their pattern of neglect followed by sudden intense interest when money became involved actually supports our case. I met with Harold that afternoon to review the legal challenge. Reading through Michael and Sarah's accusations felt like being punched repeatedly in the stomach. They painted me as a confused old woman, easily manipulated by people who didn't have my best interests at heart. They cited my isolation from family, my erratic behavior in cutting contact with them, my susceptibility to outside influence from new friends. How can they claim I'm isolated from family when they're the ones who forgot my birthday 4 years running? I asked Harold. They're arguing that your reaction to their neglect was disproportionate and evidence of mental instability. They're essentially saying that a rational person would have simply talked to them about feeling unappreciated rather than changing her will. Because talking worked so well all the other times I tried it. Joan, I need you to prepare yourself for what's coming. This is going to get ugly. They're going to argue that you're not competent to make financial decisions, that you need a guardian, that your assets should be placed in trust until your death. The full weight of what my children were trying to do hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just trying to reclaim their inheritance. They were trying to take away my autonomy, my right to make decisions about my own life and money. Can they do that? Can they actually have me declared incompetent? They can try, but Joan, I've been practicing elder law for 30 years, and I've never seen a case with weaker grounds for incompetency. You're clearly of sound mind, you're managing your affairs independently, you're making rational decisions about your estate. The fact that your children don't like those decisions doesn't make them evidence of mental decline. That evening, I called Jennifer to tell her about the legal challenge. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished explaining what Michael and Sarah were alleging. "Mom, this is insane. They're really trying to have you declared incompetent?" "According to Harold, yes. What can I do to help?" "Harold may want you to testify about our recent conversations, about my mental state as you've observed it. Would you be willing to do that?" "Of course. Mom, I'm so sorry this is happening. I'm ashamed that my brothers are putting you through this." "It's not your fault, Jennifer." "But it is, partly. We all contributed to the situation that made you feel like you had to protect yourself this way. And now Michael and Sarah are making it worse by attacking you instead of examining their own behavior." After talking to Jennifer, I called Dorothy to warn her that she might be dragged into the legal proceedings. "Let them come," Dorothy said fiercely. "I'll be happy to tell any judge who will listen that you're one of the sanest, most rational people I know. And if they want to argue that encouraging a friend to value herself constitutes undue influence, they're going to have a very hard time proving that in court." The next few weeks were a blur of meetings with Harold, reviewing documents and preparing for depositions. Michael and Sarah's lawyers wanted to depose me, Dorothy, Jennifer, Dr. Henning, and even Tommy, whom they'd somehow learned about through their investigation into my changed behavior patterns. The deposition was scheduled for a conference room in Harold's building, and I arrived that morning dressed in my best suit, determined to present myself as the competent, clear-thinking woman I knew myself to be. Michael and Sarah's attorney was a sharp-dressed man in his 40s, who treated me with the kind of condescending politeness usually reserved for elderly relatives at family gatherings. For 3 hours, he asked me questions designed to make me appear confused, manipulated, or mentally unstable. He questioned my decision-making process, my relationships with Dorothy and Tommy, my motivations for changing the will. I answered each question clearly and directly, refusing to be flustered by his implications or insulted by his assumptions. "Mrs. Roberts," he said toward the end of the deposition, "don't you think your children deserve to inherit something from the woman who raised them?" "Mr. Patterson," I replied, "I think my children deserve exactly what they've earned through their treatment of me, which, in this case, is nothing." "Even though they're sorry for their mistakes and want to make amends?" "They're sorry they lost their inheritance. If they were sorry for their treatment of me, they wouldn't be trying to have me declared mentally incompetent, rather than simply accepting the consequences of their choices." Harold told me afterward that I'd done beautifully, that my responses had been clear, consistent, and demonstrated excellent reasoning ability. The depositions of my supporters went equally well. Dorothy was fierce in her defense of my mental acuity, providing specific examples of conversations we'd had that demonstrated my clear thinking and rational decision-making. Jennifer was emotional but articulate in describing our recent reconciliation and her observations of my mental state. Dr. Henning presented her test results and professional opinion with unshakable confidence. Tommy's deposition was perhaps the most powerful, precisely because he had no financial interest in the outcome. When asked about my mental state, he described a woman who was engaged with life, learning new skills, making thoughtful decisions about her future. When asked if he'd noticed any signs of confusion or manipulation, he laughed. "Joan Roberts is one of the most independent, strong-willed people I've ever met," he said. "The idea that she could be manipulated into doing anything she didn't want to do is absurd to anyone who actually knows her." By July, it was clear that Michael and Sarah's case was falling apart. Their lawyers had been unable to produce any credible evidence of mental incompetency or undue influence. Every expert who examined me confirmed my mental fitness. Every friend who testified described a woman making rational choices about her own life. Harold called me on a Thursday morning with news I'd been hoping to hear. Joan, they're withdrawing the challenge. Michael and Sarah's lawyers have advised them that they have no chance of success, and that continuing the case would only result in expensive legal fees, with no possibility of recovery. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair, feeling relief flood through me like cool water. It's over? It's over. Your will stands as written. Your mental competency is legally established. And frankly, their attempt to challenge it has created a public record that will make any future challenges extremely difficult. That evening, I celebrated quietly with Tommy and Dorothy, sharing a bottle of champagne and reflecting on what the past months had taught me about family, love, and the importance of standing up for yourself. You did it, Dorothy said, raising her glass. You beat them. No, I said, thinking about Jennifer's transformation, about the peace I'd found in choosing my own worth over their approval. I saved myself. There's a difference. August brought my 75th birthday, and for the first time in 5 years, I looked forward to it. I planned my own celebration. A small party in my garden with Dorothy, Tommy, Jennifer, and a few friends from my pottery class. We ate cake from the local bakery, told stories, and laughed until the fireflies came out to dance in the honeysuckle. Jennifer had made me a beautiful ceramic vase in her own pottery class, glazed in shades of blue that reminded me of summer skies. Tommy surprised me with a watercolor set and canvases, encouraging me to try painting outdoors. Dorothy gave me a journal with a note that said, "For recording the adventures still to come." As the evening wound down and my guests helped clean up, I felt a contentment I'd never experienced before. This was what a birthday celebration looked like when it was attended by people who actually wanted to be there, who valued my presence in their lives rather than simply fulfilling obligations. Jennifer was the last to leave, lingering to help me wrap up the leftover cake. "Mom," she said as we worked together in the kitchen, "I know this was a hard year for you, with the legal challenge and everything, but watching you fight for yourself, watching you refuse to be diminished by people who should have known better, it's been inspiring, even though it meant giving up your inheritance. Especially because of that, you taught me something I didn't learn growing up, which is that love has to be reciprocal to be real, that relationships require effort from both sides, that you can't take someone for granted forever and expect them to keep giving. And what are you going to do with that lesson? I'm going to try to be the kind of person who deserves the love she receives. In all my relationships, not just with you." After Jennifer left, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea, watching the last of the summer light fade from the sky. In the distance, I could hear the sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening, children being called in for baths, doors closing, lights coming on in kitchen windows. I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years ago, sitting alone on her birthday, waiting for phone calls that never came. That woman had been broken by neglect, diminished by other people's indifference, convinced that her worth was determined by how much her children needed her. The woman I was now understood that worth comes from within, that love is a choice that must be made daily, that some relationships are worth fighting for and others are worth ending. I had learned to value myself enough to demand the same from others. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dorothy, asking if I'd had a good birthday. I typed back that it had been perfect, then added that I was grateful for friends who knew how to celebrate the people they loved. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught sight of myself in the bedroom mirror. 75 years old, silver-haired, laugh-lined, but standing straighter than I had in years. I looked like a woman who knew her worth, who had chosen dignity over desperation, who had finally learned the difference between being loved and being used. In the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, my will remained unchanged. The Joan Roberts Foundation for Single Mothers in Education would continue to help women who faced the challenges I had faced. The housing nonprofit would eventually benefit from the house where I'd raised 3 children who forgot my birthday 4 years running. The Cancer Research Center would receive funds to help other women fight the disease I'd beaten. But more important than any of that was the knowledge that I had stood up for myself when it mattered most. I had refused to be diminished by people who should have cherished me. I had chosen my own worth over their comfort, my dignity over their convenience. My children would inherit something far more valuable than money. They would inherit the knowledge that actions have consequences, that love must be reciprocal to survive, that taking someone for granted is the fastest way to lose them. Jennifer had already begun learning these lessons. Perhaps someday Michael and Sarah would too. But whether they did or not was no longer my concern. I had given them everything I had to give as their mother. The rest was up to them. I turned off the lights and settled into bed, comfortable in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, and I would meet it as Joan Roberts, a woman who knew her value. That was the best gift I could give myself, and the most important lesson I could leave behind. The future stretched ahead of me, uncertain, but full of possibility. There would be more pottery classes, more paintings to attempt, more travels with Dorothy, more quiet evenings with Tommy, more phone calls from Jennifer that came from love rather than obligation. There would be more birthdays celebrated by people who wanted to be there, more relationships built on mutual respect rather than assumed devotion. I had forgotten my children and my estate plan forever, just as they had forgotten me on my birthday for 4 years running. But in doing so, I had finally remembered myself. And that was worth more than any inheritance could ever be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.